Hello, welcome to the Language and Power podcast. I am Michael Farrelly and Tom is with me. Hi, Tom.
Hello, Michael, everyone.
How are you doing?
Grand, thank you.
Today, we've got a special guest, Dr. Hayley Walker from the Department of International Negotiation and Conflict Management of ESSEC School of Management, Lille, France. How are you doing, Hayley?
I'm very well, Michael. Thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're very welcome. And just to give a bit of context, at the beginning of this series, Tom and I spoke about COP29. We spoke about the press coverage, and as part of our background research, we came across Hayley's work on legitimacy, on trust in COP processes, and you've done loads of work on COPs for quite some time, Hayley. So we're delighted to get a real expert on COPs to tell us about what's happening. I want to talk first a little bit about the COP that's just happened. COP30 has just happened in Belém in Brazil. And I'm going to start off with a quote and then maybe get your take on it. So this is from the president of COP30, Andre Correa do Lago, and he says of the COP30, 195 parties adopted the Belém package this afternoon, demonstrating humanity's resolve to turn urgency into unity and unity into action in tackling climate change. The 29 decisions approved by consensus include agreements on topics such as transition, adaptation, finance, trade, gender and technology, renewing the collective commitment to accelerated action, and a climate regime more connected to people's lives. He goes on to say, the spirit we built here does not end with the gavel. It continues in every government meeting, every boardroom and trade union, every classroom, laboratory, forest community, large city and coastal town. So that's the official kind of full stop, I guess, under the event itself. What's your take, Hayley, on what happened at COP30 in terms of outcomes?
Well, I think there were many successes. As you mentioned, adaptation finance, just transition mechanism, gender action plan were all successfully adopted. But I think that satisfaction is measured not in objective and absolute terms, but rather in subjective and relative terms. What I mean by that is the gap between our expectations and reality. So if I go to the dentist thinking this is going to be awful and it's actually all right, I'll feel really happy. Whereas if I go to see a sequel of my favorite film and I'm expecting it to be great and it's not as good as I was hoping, I'll go away thinking that was terrible, even if it wasn't really that bad. Before COP30, I feel expectations were rather low, given the geopolitical context in which we find ourselves. But then during the COP, expectations got raised. People thought that an agreement could also be reached on developing concrete plans or roadmaps, as they're being called, to phase out fossil fuels, to bridge the gap on climate finance and halt deforestation. These items weren't on the formal negotiation agenda, but it was hoped that they could be included in what's known as a cover decision. And this is negotiated informally through shuttle diplomacy organized by the Presidency. When the cover decision didn't include any of these roadmaps, many felt disappointed and considered the COP to be a failure. This is why, personally, I didn't think it was a great idea to negotiate a cover decision. It wasn't necessary, it wasn't mandated, and in this geopolitical context, I didn't think it would achieve much. But what's more, I think that the negotiations have by and large done what we needed them to do. We have the political framework in place for global climate action, that's the Paris Agreement. Now the focus needs to be on implementing it, or in other words, moving from promises to action. Outside of the intergovernmental negotiations, there's this whole other sphere of the COP called the Action Agenda. This is where governments and non-governmental actors alike can showcase how they're implementing the Paris Agreement, share best practices, and learn from each other on how to move forwards faster. This, for me, is where the focus of our energy and attention should be. This is where all the really exciting and positive things are happening, whereas it feels like we're stuck or even going backwards on the politics. In the real world economy, what you see happening in the action agenda, things are moving ahead at pace. So my feel was that a cover decision and all the negotiations that go with it would dominate the media and diplomatic attention. So I was happy and excited to hear from the Brazilian presidency in the run-up to the COP that they weren't planning to do a cover decision. They were instead labeling COP30 as the COP of implementation with a greater focus on the action agenda. So to go back to this idea of satisfaction being a product of your expectations meeting reality, I felt quite disappointed that at the last minute, the Brazilians decided they were going to negotiate a cover decision. And then, as I expected, that sucked in all of the media and political attention without really delivering anything in the way of progress. That being said, after the second withdrawal of the US from the Paris Agreement and all the hostility coming from the White House towards the energy transition, I think we should celebrate the fact that all remaining countries of the world were able to come together and reaffirm by consensus their commitment to climate action and to the multilateral process. Politically speaking, we didn't move forwards, but we didn't move backwards. Governments held the line, and in so doing, kept the space open for other actors to continue moving ahead in the transition to a clean, green economy.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that really fascinating summary of what happened in COP. I wonder why the Brazilian presidency decided to change its agenda and focus at that point.
I'm just speculating here. I wasn't in Brazil. I didn't travel to COP for reasons we can maybe discuss later. I think perhaps they came under some pressure from governments, but also civil society. I think there was an expectation. Since the Paris COP, pretty much every presidency has done a cover decision. So there's a bit of pressure and expectation that they would follow suit. It could also be a solution to a problem they were facing with regards to the agenda. This is quite typical for climate negotiations. Before they can start negotiating, they have to adopt the agenda. You always have countries coming with extra issues, trying to add them to the agenda. And this can take up days. There was an intersessional meeting in Bonn in Germany earlier this year, and almost the entire first week was lost to these agenda fights. So it could have been, a strategic response to that. We're not going to add any of these issues to the formal agenda, but we'll discuss it informally in a cover decision. Another explanation could perhaps be that it was a political gamble. They thought they could push governments to go further. If they'd been able to achieve this, a roadmap on the fossil fuel phase out, on climate finance, it would have been a huge success. I would say up there with what the French achieved in 2015. So I think perhaps they rolled the dice. They thought they might be able to get away with it, but with the US pulling out, the resistance from some other countries that are less in favor of ambitious climate action won the day.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
I'm thinking every COP wants to be remembered as the COP that did something. I remember when in Glasgow, that was it. You don't want to be the COP that held the line, as I think you described it. That's,
exactly.
The COP that wasn't too bad compared with the previous ones. Interesting. Can you tell us about these cover decisions and how they relate to other processes within the COP, just to give everyone listening a clear idea of what they are? Because they seem to be structured in a different way and a different level of formality, but headline grabbing nonetheless.
They're definitely headline grabbing. This is the headline decision. This is what gets all the media coverage, but it's not actually formally mandated. Like I said, it's quite recent, this phenomena whereby presidencies take it upon themselves, on top of all the extra work they have to do, to have these informal negotiations behind closed doors, shuttle diplomacy, to see if they can get all governments to agree on a package deal that incorporates different issues that might have different levels of importance to different governments, but which can't make it onto the formal agenda. So on the formal agenda, it's mandated that these things have been agreed far in advance. The cover decision, I think, I was surprised when I started seeing presidencies do this year after year, because it hands a lot of power to the presidency. This is what's going to get the headlines, and they're really holding the pen on that process. They're the ones mediating, they're the ones drafting. And I expected there'd be more pushback from governments. Governments jealously guard their decision-making power, particularly in the UNFCCC, where the climate negotiations take place. There's a lot of resistance to giving the presidency real power. And this does give them tremendous power, which is all well and good when it's the British presidency who wanted to advance climate action. Perhaps less of a good thing when it's maybe a presidency with different objectives.
That's very interesting in the fact that you've done a lot of research on this, as we said at the beginning, and we're going to speak a little bit more about a recent article you had published, an academic article, which we'll put a link to in the show description. So that's called Access and Meaningful Participation of Non-State Actors in the UNFCCC Process, Path Dependencies in the Era of Megacops. We'll talk about megacops in a little while. As part of that research, you've got a table in there which highlights, I think, something that's perhaps not always clear to kind of the casual observer, and I count myself amongst that as well, is that we've got these major treaties in the history of the COPs. We've got Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris. And those are the three major recent treaties. But in recent times, as we've been talking about, the COPs seems want to have something that's almost matches or one-ups on previous COPs. So, we've managed to solve this incredible problem. Or, we've done more than that. We've done this. And it seems almost as though there's a self-propelling process of trying to get bigger in terms of outcomes. And I wonder what you thought about that. And then that also fits in with your notion in that article about this momentum or the COPs kind of keep having this forward motion of getting bigger, sucking things into it, and you'll be able to explain it better than I can. But yeah,
it's this sort of self-reinforcing cycle, this path dependency. It's difficult to get away from. So the bigger the COPs become, the more they attract media, political energy and attention, which in turn attracts more participants. It becomes seen as the place to be. If you're anyone who's anyone in climate, you can't not be there, which in turn makes them bigger, which in turn attracts more energy, and so on and so forth. I think you're right when you imply there's this kind of one-upmanship with each successive COP presidency. They invest a lot of resources. It costs a lot of money. It takes up a lot of human resources to host a COP. And you want something back in return for that. You want, like Tom said, you want a good headline, not the COP that held the line. But that in turn, it makes it difficult to break out of this cycle. There's no incentive for presidencies to try and downsize things. This is why I was excited to hear that the Brazilians were going to try and move some of this, attention and energy away from the negotiations towards implementation and the action agenda. That's what I argue with my co-author, Lisanna Grun, in this paper. That's what we need. And it's great that there's so much energy and attention around climate change. Don't think we'd be where we are today. Governments wouldn't have gone so far if there hadn't been all this attention on the issue. But are more and more negotiations going to deliver? No, it's action on the ground that's going to deliver. We close the paper by asking, is there a way to redirect this energy and attention from the negotiations towards implementation to recreate this self-reinforcing cycle to make the action agenda the place to be? How can we make the action agenda sexy? How can we make this the headline, the place where everyone wants to be, and create this kind of one-upmanship? Governments trying to outdo each other in terms of their implementation, their climate action. If we can get those self-reinforcing dynamics, that's what we need right now.
So I'm just wondering on that, and before we go on to the main thrust of your article, this idea of the headline and the coverage on COP, I wonder responsibilities, but what responsibility do the media pay here? What responsibility do they have for this? Because they like to cover it as a spectacle. They're interested in the world leaders on the stage. They're interested in, the exotic groups coming in and the dancers in the streets. And that sort of feeds into this. The level of coverage depends on the spectacle, and they like to talk about the size and everything. So governments are sort of encouraged to do that to get coverage. But this is focusing in on really peripheral stuff that's not central to the stuff you're talking about that we need to focus in on. And for the rest of the year, you're not getting coverage of climate change, environmental disaster, and negotiations about it in the same way. Because it's become the big yearly headline event, the press are treating it like the opening ceremony of the Olympics rather than the Games. I wonder if that's part of the problem in the general media coverage of what COP is to them and as a spectacle.
I think it's difficult for the media to cover the COP. As it becomes bigger, it becomes more complex. It's also very, very technical. These successes I mentioned at the start, the gender action plan, the just transition mechanism, it's technical. It's not easy to cover in 150 characters. They want a headline, something simple to communicate, and that's quite challenging. When I've been speaking with journalists in the run-up to and during the COP, I've been trying to communicate the story is not the negotiations. The story is implementation. But then, yeah, the cover decision happened and all the talk was about the roadmaps, and that was no longer the case. But I think also sorry, you go ahead, Mike.
Could I just ask you about that? So if we're thinking from the point of view of us as discourse analysts, we think about COPs as these events, and we think about the communication side of it, the communicative acts that come out of this. And from what you're saying, it sounds like that you've mentioned a couple of times, there's the negotiation side. So what people are going there to do is to negotiate, or at least, as you argue in your article, there are some people that are going there to do the negotiation.
Yeah.
And then there are other people going there to do something else, which is the action implementation side of things. So there's a clear split in the purpose at the very general level. The purpose of these COPs, there's the negotiation purpose, and then there's the action/implementation purpose. Could you just say a bit more about that and who's involved in each side, and how is the COP structured around those two slightly different purposes?
Sure, yeah. So when I'm teaching on the COPs, I describe this as two COPs in one. There's the COP of negotiations and there's the COP of implementation. The COP of negotiations is much smaller, between maybe 5,000 and 10,000 people. The COP of implementation, this is where the huge numbers come from, tens of thousands of people. The COP of negotiations, like I said, it's technical. It's very difficult to understand what's going on. Even myself, as someone who's been following this for many years now, if I would just go and sit down into one of those negotiations, what are you talking about? Acronyms, jargon, it's quite archaic. I tell my students, this is actually not where you want to be. It's frustrating. It can even be quite depressing. It feels like, it's moving at glacial pace. The COP of implementation is where, the action is happening, literally and figuratively. This is where governments, non-governmental actors, cities, regions, businesses, finance institutes are moving ahead. I mentioned in my opening remarks, the politics of climate is rather stuck at the moment. It's in a difficult place, but the real world economy is moving forward. And we don't hear about that enough. If you'd ask someone in the street, they say politicians, businesses, everyone's moving backwards. That's not the case. You have these climate weeks. There's one in London, there's one in New York. It's kind of like a global climate trade fair. The Climate Week in New York this year was the biggest one ever. Businesses are moving forward, but we don't hear about this. And my worry is if we keep hearing only these negative things about the COP, that can actually send a message to the rest of the world, to the private sector, to business. Like, this isn't happening anymore, don't bother. So to come back to Tom's question, what is the role of the media here? I came across this word just the other day. It's word of the year or something, rage bait.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's really helpful for me in communicating on this. I feel there's a lot of rage bait in the media when it comes to COPs. It's actually quite unhelpful. Most people, when I first start talking to students or anybody about the COPs, it's just, blah, 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 corporate lobbyists. And that's really not the case.
Just when you were saying, I found that really interesting, that point you made at the beginning that you're developing now about, in fact, we've got the policy moving slowly, but the practice moving quicker. Normally, we accuse things of not keeping up to date with the policy and the policy being unrealistic. To actually hear that the practices are outpacing the policies is really interesting, that it's being led by the processes and the policies having trouble keeping up, which is a better news story, I suppose, because that's where the real action is. I suppose that fits in again, as you said, with the expectations and the public reception of it. And if they're disappointed, it'll be this circle type of path dependency in itself, I suppose, where it's more blah, 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 which we've got. Greta used that word a lot, if it's the word, blah, blah, blah. Michael, one word or three.
Phrase.
Blah, blah, blah. And that cycle, and that's what people like to do. Rage bait's a new one on me, which is great. How do we break that dependency on rage and negativity ourselves? Not necessarily the media, but what do we focus on you in your area ourselves as discourse analysts? But also, what are those processes? Can you talk about meaningful path dependencies and this need to get bigger and bigger? It can't be helped. It's just, the path well trod. But then, so what meaningful participation, which you talk about in different areas in terms of contributing ideas, but involved in dialogue. And again, this is where I think we say there are expectation mismatches between expectation and reality here. And that maybe we should be focusing in different areas because there's more positive stories and more work to be done in different areas from what we normally hear about.
Yeah, definitely. Listening to you made me think of something that really touches on your expertise, which is language and communication as creating and shaping social action. The way we talk about things creates these path dependencies, right? These self-fulfilling prophecies. If we say, the COP is a waste of time, people are going to take their foot off the pedal, stop implementing the Paris Agreement. What we need is hope and positivity. That's the driver for change, which is why, I'd like to see more communication on implementation, on the action agenda.
We were talking about the negotiation and the implementation side. You mentioned that the implementation involves businesses, NGOs, pressure groups, all sorts of different and diverse social actors, participants. But in the negotiation side, that's exclusively the territory of government actors. Is that right? Am I right in thinking that?
Only governments have decision-making power.
Yeah.
So they're the only ones, negotiating, making decisions at the end of the day. But that's not to say that they operate in a vacuum. On the contrary, these other non-state participants, some of them are there to showcase their climate action, to network, to learn. But many of them are also there to lobby and advocate with governments or inform the decision-making process. So I wouldn't say these two spheres are completely discrete. There's definitely connections between them.
I'm interested in the lobbying side of things. I find it amazing that there are people who are going and allowed to go and encouraged to go with the explicit purpose of putting a spanner in the works of certain parts of COP. And I think it's incredible. But what's your take on that?
I'm happy you raised that, Michael, because, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this. And it's something I'm working on at the moment, writing a piece on this. I spoke about rage bait earlier, and this is exactly what I have in mind. It does get clicks, it makes people outraged and angry and they click on it. But I don't feel what is reported is actually an accurate representation of what's really happening at COPs.
Right.
That's not to say that there are no fossil fuel lobbyists there. There are. But I think it's the numbers, the methodology used. Well, these reports are these analyses are done by NGOs whose raison d'etre is to, kick out the fossil fuel industry. Yeah. I would say there are probably fewer than you might think. But more importantly, the real fossil fuel lobbying, it's not taking place at the COP. It's taking place in capitals all around the world. So I 100% agree, with civil society and the NGOs fighting against fossil fuel lobbying. Fossil fuel lobbying is one of the most important reasons why we're in the place we're at, where government action, collective global action is lagging so far behind what the science clearly tells us is necessary. The lobbying is not happening at the COP. Governments come to the COP with their positions already formed months in advance. A government's position is formed in London, in Paris, it's negotiated between different ministries. Those who seek to influence government's position, that's the moment, that's the stage in the policy cycle where they need to go and lobby and advocate. By the time they get to the COP, these positions are pretty much sealed. The technical negotiators have their red lines. They have very little mandate to deviate from those. The only ones who can deviate from position are the ministers who come in the final days. I was talking earlier about this energy. There's so much energy. I feel like there's this groundswell, particularly among young people, to do something about this. It's quite understandable. It's their future that's at stake. How can we best channel that energy to where it's most helpful? What I would love to see is people marching in the street in London, demanding action from their national government. Criticizing the COP, which has many flaws. It's far from perfect, but like that old saying on democracy, it's the least worst, the least bad form of governance we have.
Yeah, no, that's great. It was absolutely fantastic to hear that. And I think hearing you say that, it makes so much sense about where would the lobbying actually happen, where would it be most effective. But that also, I guess, brings us to, perhaps if we can go back to this idea of if we've got the negotiation, some negotiations are happening, they've got set positions that go there and the ministers come towards the end and potentially can change things. We've got the implementation side of the COP as well happening there. But you've alluded to this, and perhaps we can unpick this a bit more, of this idea of what you've called, or people in your field have called, the mega COP, and this starting post, I think, Paris, is that right? So could you tell us about what's meant by a mega COP? What are the numbers involved, and what's these consequence of COPs becoming mega.
I don't think there's a precise definition or a threshold in terms of participant numbers, but I would say, it started with Paris. When you look back at participation numbers, they peak when you had, the adoption of a major treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, or the Copenhagen Summit, which was supposed to adopt a treaty but didn't, and Paris. So the numbers would peak at these, big COPs that were going to adopt a treaty, and then fall back to steady numbers. Since Paris, that's not been the case. Numbers, particularly in the past few years, just keep getting bigger and bigger. They reached a peak in Dubai at COP28, where it was almost 100,000 people, which is crazy. It's not quite at that. Now it's sort of, 50,000, I think 56,000 in Belém. Where do they come from? Yeah, it's this self-reinforcing cycle, right? And we use a metaphor taken from organizational ecology in the paper. The idea that when energy and area are increased, it increases the populational density. And that's what we see at the COP. You have more energy, more people attending. The COPs get bigger and bigger, but then it's a much more dense environment for, these NGOs or other stakeholders who are trying to either, lobby for ambitious policy or achieve some other objectives, policy learning. Basically put, there are only so many participation opportunities at a COP, only so many meeting rooms. There are only so many slots for side events and exhibits. There are only so many hours in each policymaker's day, and if you're there competing with 30,000 other people, it's going to be a lot harder for you to achieve your objectives. It's a question of the quantity of participation undermining the quality. And this is why we argue in the paper that it could be helpful to downsize the COPs, but that's easier said than done. As we've mentioned already, there's no incentive for COP presidencies to downsize. And with this path-dependent dynamic, I don't think we're going to break that. What I hope is that we can divert that energy into implementation in the action agenda. But seeing what happened in Brazil, that seems easier said than done. But one possible solution that we highlight in the paper is to look at a little known category of participation called party overflow. Party refers to the governments who are parties to the convention. And then you have observers. These are all the non-state actors who do a lot more than just observe, trying to influence and inform the process. As an intergovernmental process, it's created for governments, by governments. There's no limit on the size of a government delegation. Parties can send as many people as they like. They have been sensitive about the size of their delegation, so they created what's known as party overflow. And that used to allow governments to add as many people as they liked onto their delegation without them appearing in the public lists. That changed a few years ago. The UN Climate Secretariat introduced some new rules in response to the public outcry around fossil fuel lobbyists. It was to improve transparency. So not only observers, but also parties are now asked to provide the names and the affiliations of everybody in their delegation, including party overflow. And you probably will have seen, these analyses of the number of fossil fuel lobbyists at each COP. In 2023, these analyses, it quadrupled. So the number of fossil fuel lobbyists from one year to the next. That was the year when party overflow was first reported. And this is another reason why I feel like this civil society campaign to kick out the fossil fuel lobby is misdirected, because even if somehow you could change the rules around observer participation, which I think is unlikely because all decisions are made by consensus, even if through some informal mechanism you were able to say anyone connected to the fossil fuel can no longer participate as an observer, what would happen? They'd join the government delegations in even greater numbers, thereby giving them more influence and access to the negotiation process.
Interesting. Really. Yeah. And so that starts to take us into the territory that you were exploring in your article. We've got these this overflow category, and what you argue is that if governments could be encouraged to focus on that and reduce that overflow category, what's the argument there?
Thank you for bringing me back on track there, Michael. I forgot to finish my point. Yeah, exactly. Don't think it's a party-driven process, and governments won't agree to limit the size of their delegations. But if there could just be more attention, media attention, political attention on this category of party overflow, just shining a spotlight on that would encourage them to rein it in. You know, if they know they're going to be under scrutiny, they would be a bit more restrained in who they're adding to their delegation. So to put this in context, the numbers we're talking about here, in COP28, there were over 23,000 participants in this party overflow category. And that was around 50% of all party badges. Mm. Do they all need to be there? And I also think it's problematic, this category, because it's effectively taking badges away from the observers. The Secretariat, when they allocate badges, they first have to accommodate government requests because it is an intergovernmental process. They know the size of the venue. They have to wait until the government requests have come in. Only then, with the remaining badges, can they divide them between the admitted non-governmental organizations. So yeah, it's a fixed pie. The party overflow badges are coming at the expense of observers. Who are the ones benefiting? I think we can imply, yes, fossil fuel industry representatives, also researchers. You know, I need to be transparent and hold my hands up in the air here. I have benefited from party overflow badge in the past to do my field work, but it's the people who already have, you know, these strong connections with governments. So, you know, we can talk about equity, who is at the COP, who is not at the COP. And I think this party overflow is exacerbating these structural inequities. It's the ones who already have, you know, the connections and the links that get the badges.
You said previously that you might tell us why you weren't in Belém. So this might be an appropriate moment for you to tell us that.
Yeah, so as I think, you know, we'll be clear from this discussion, I've been arguing that we need to downsize the COPs. Not everybody needs to be traveling there, not just because of the huge carbon footprint it creates, but also because the quantity of participation is undermining the quality. I could quite easily have gotten a badge to go to the COP, but at whose expense? If I had, you know, a very important reason for being there, absolutely, but I didn't this year. It would just be to see what's going on. And there's also virtual participation. That's what I did this year. I was able to follow the negotiations virtually from my living room. There was one particular agenda item that I was interested in following. There was no need for me to travel all the way to Brazil to do that. So that's something I'd also like to see encouraged, more virtual participation. You can retain kind of the inclusivity without adding to these sort of problematic path-dependent dynamics.
So I think there were, from reading your paper, there's sort of twin conclusions, and one was the downsizing of these extra delegates and therefore freeing up room for other people to be there. But also, what you did, the online participant, you also talked about moving the focus away from what happens at the COP, because what happens at the COP is largely predetermined and it's not where the real action happens, that sort of thing. So thinking ahead, I mean, we've talked about this as discourse analysts, and often we do focus on the rage bait because it makes for good papers and it's easy to do. If we want to analysts in your own field and ours of discourse analysis, where then do we look? How is this process distributed across time and space? And where are the points? In the first place, it's important that we all understand this and work out what is the nature of the distribution of labour. Michael and I are doing another project with Glasgow City Council where we were focusing on an end product. And the more we get to know about the processes behind that, constraints and affordances along the way and where all the decisions are made, it's really important. It makes you understand the inertia and where the developments are, but it also makes your critique more focused and possibly more beneficial, more positive. So I think these are ideas that you're bringing up as well. So researchers in your field, but also I feel this analysis, where would you say we should be focusing our efforts? If we want to work on this, as you said, the implementation, I think you particularly say, and we want to see how implementation takes place, chart how that happens through discourse, but also possibly help in some way and intervene, where are the spots we should be looking at?
Good question, because the COP is just the tip of the iceberg, really. That's where all the attention is. But there's work going on all year round. There are subsidiary bodies, constituted bodies, where the work of implementation is taking place. I mentioned there's the intersessional, which always takes place at the headquarters of the UN Climate Secretariat in Bonn in Germany. That takes place every year in May, June. If I'm going to go in person to conduct some field work, that's where I go. It's just a train ride away. It's around 5,000 participants involved in the negotiations. It's a lot easier for me as a researcher if I want to sit down and interview somebody. You're not competing with 30,000, 40,000 other people for their time and attention. So that's something to look out for. It's called the SBs, the subsidiary bodies that meet in Bonn every year. And then I mentioned also the constituted bodies. So these are bodies that are set up to deal with a particular, so you have, for example, the Adaptation Fund, you have the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Here you have technical experts. They meet regularly, either in person or online. When it comes to participation and inclusion, many of these constituted bodies are much more open to non-state actor participation. The COPs have their UN rules of procedure, and it's quite limited for non-state actors. Each constituted body has its own rules of procedure. Many of them are much more open. So, for those wanting to get involved, those with technical expertise to contribute to these processes, it would be great if more coverage could be dedicated to these. But it's not as sexy as the COP because you don't have the political leaders there.
Yeah.
Finally, you have regional climate weeks. These are kind of like the COPs without the negotiations. So everything else is going on there. They have one in Latin America and Caribbean. There's one in Africa. There's one in Asia Pacific. And these take place in the months leading up to the COP. These are to showcase and drive implementation. You'll also have government policy makers there, but without any negotiations. So they have a lot more time on their hands to engage in meaningful dialogue with stakeholders. And these are probably, the easiest to access of all. You can participate as an individual. They're very open and accessible. But again, unfortunately, don't get a lot of coverage. Most people have never heard of them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it comes back to the other side of your paper, which is about the perception of the big COP events and the expectation that leads to for lots of NGO and new participants who don't have the experience to make the most of being in this competitive environment of the major COP. So
exactly. It's population density.
You were talking earlier about there's lack of expectations. You've got the environmental groups, the NGOs, and all these people who think more can be done at the COP than can actually be done, coming away disappointed. In a way, that leads to media coverage of the lack of movement, the inertia. There's nothing that feeds more into the discourse of climate change deniers than the inability of big government institutions to do anything. So you've got the sort of process that's simultaneously sapping the energy of the NGOs and encouraging the climate change deniers and people like that of the impossibility of action. So it's very detrimental, isn't it? Failure to meet expectations.
This is what I've been working on recently, the undermining of the legitimacy of the COP. Coming from a good place can actually, as you allude, Tom, can play right into the hands of the fossil fuel industry. Yeah. If the UNFCCC would crumble, people think it's too big to fail, but after the failed Copenhagen summit in 2009, governments around the world were seriously considering shifting forum to the G20. I think if this continues, this undermining of the legitimacy, it could happen. If it would move from the UNFCCC to the G20, that's far less inclusive, far less transparent, it gives far more opportunities to the fossil fuel industry to achieve their objectives.
And one of the things you proposed in your paper, the answer to that side that you propose is to adjust expectations of what happens in the implementation side of things. And I think you've got some quite concrete proposals for that. So what would you say about those?
It comes back to the point you were making about misaligned expectations. People go to the COP for the first time thinking, I'm going to influence the negotiation process, and come away feeling disappointed, disillusioned, even cynical and frustrated. How can we address that? How can we, manage expectations? Through capacity building, trainings, initiatives to educate first-time COP participants around the intergovernmental nature of the process. So highlighting, the avenues that they can contribute inputs, but also, the constraints and the limitations at the COP as an intergovernmental body. But I'd also like to see a lot more attention and energy given to promoting these other avenues of participation, the SBs, the constituted bodies, regional climate weeks, to facilitate more effective participation.
And I guess, I get a final question or kind of observation from me is I was looking back at some of the stuff that we'd talked about in the first episode of this series when we were talking about the previous COP and media coverage of that, because we've been talking about the media attention here on one side of COP, and perhaps I think you said earlier the negative, the really kind of negative side of it, and it's that kind of undermines the legitimacy which is so important to keep hold of. It seems that the negotiation side of things has this capacity for an inbuilt drama. So it's the brinkmanship. Is there going to be? Is there going to be is there going to be a last minute deal? Are the participants going to stay up till midnight? It's almost the same in the past few years. Every year, and back corridor kind of things going on until the last minute. Something happens.
Or nothing.
Or nothing. It's the drama of that series ending. What's the cliffhanger? I wonder if there's anything about the other side of this, the alternative venues, the kind of alternative side of the main COP that kind of lends itself to something that kind of speaks to the news values that reporters, correspondents, editors kind of like to pick up on to the story. I don't know.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Sort of like the negotiations kind of easily give rise to a narrative.
Yeah.
That's a helpful way of looking at it. How can you create a narrative around the action agenda? I think there's also a psychological dimension to it. As humans, we are drawn to the center of decision-making power. In the paper, we suggested, can you get the politicians somehow involved, like a high-level leaders event in the action agenda, where the leaders go, the media follows.
Well, that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
Oh, fabulous. I really enjoyed that. It was just really nice talking about your article and also all the other things that came out of that and the stuff that's of interest to us all. But really, really fruitful and fun.
Yeah, Hayley, thank you ever so much for talking us through all of that. And I think it's from our point of view. I mean, we've spoken about these things a couple of times before, but it's really good, really important to get that backstory, the information about what's happening and how these things are structured, the purpose about the negotiations, the different purpose of the action agenda. It's really, really useful.
And for us as researchers, I think, as well as media, we're drawn to the glamour and the big sexy stuff, but also we're drawn to the rage bait. And maybe the real stories are in the good people just working away very slowly in the background without much glamour, and that's where the real work's being done and all the positive work.
That's what I've been trying to think about, and I don't have a good answer yet, but I think it would be worth. What is it that attracts us to the glamour and the rage bait? If we understand that, can we then apply that to action agenda and implementation?
Yes, absolutely. To be continued. Right. Okay. Well, Hayley, thank you ever so much. Tom, thanks for your insights too.
Thank you for the platform, for this lovely discussion to talk about all these nerdy topics that I love so much.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot.